Good morning. My name is Luis Sala, and I'm Alfresco's Director of Technology Alliances. I manage Alfresco's relationship with technology partners, basically software companies, ISVs, et cetera. And one of the partners that I work with the most is Amazon Web Services. I'm also just an old-time Alfresco employee. I've been here since 2006. I did leave the company for about 8 months in 2011, but we do not talk about that. It never happened. So before we begin, you can follow along. I have uploaded the slides. They should post within the next 20, 30 minutes. So if you visit that URL, it will take you to the page on the Alfresco Summit website where you can download the presentation and you can rate the session. It's always good to get feedback, so do let me know if you like it. If I did an okay job, I would be very grateful. And so let's leave it up for just a few more seconds while people trickle in. You're late. You're late. Oh God, and it's these slackers. Maurizio, how could you do this to me? All right, so let's start with the survey. How many of you guys are system integration partners or basically consultants and stuff like that? Just raise your hand, please. That's the greater majority of you. For the remainder of you, are you guys customers? I see some Alfresco employees as well, but a handful of customers. Good to know. So you guys are deploying Alfresco on behalf of customers since you're primarily partners. How many of these deployments are on bare metal? So raise your hand if the bulk of your deployments are on bare metal, in other words, on the machine itself, not using virtualization, okay? Raise your hand if that's what you do the most of. So most of you then seem to be using virtualization, is that right? Raise your hand. Is it VMware? Amazon? Do you guys use Amazon? So let's start with VMware. VMware, raise your hand. Okay. Amazon, AWS, a few. Okay. All right. So when you deploy to VMware, are you deploying on-premise? And by this, what I mean is, in the customer's data center or your own, servers and stuff like that. Basically, servers that you control completely, right? Is that the case? Are you mostly doing on-premise deployments? Yes, yes, yes. Okay, that's the majority. Great. How experienced are you deploying Alfresco clusters? So if you consider yourself, reasonably sophisticated and reasonably experienced deploying Alfresco clusters, raise your hand. A lot fewer of you. I'm counting about 5 or 6 hands. All right. And for those of you that have deployed an Alfresco cluster, how long does it take you? Now, for this, you've got to speak up. So give me some numbers. How long does it take you to set up a cluster and you know it works? This gentleman here is looking at his right side or left side. Does that mean he's being creative and making something up, or he's actually remembering? No, but go ahead, tell me. What do you think? On average? 2 days to do a fully redundant Alfresco cluster, fault tolerant, and you know it's going to work. So in other words, you know that you can just give it to the customer and they will never, well, not they will never call you, but if they have an issue, it's going to be relatively minor. It's not going to be a critical issue where the server is not available. If you want to be sure, a week, 2 weeks? How long does it take to, well, and by the way, for the rest of you who did clusters, how long does it take you? So on a good day or week or whatever, 2 days, up to a week, but anybody else? 2 days? Right. Assuming all the elements are in place, right? So if the database is already set up and clustered, what if it's not? So if you're starting from ground zero and all you have really are, somebody gave you 6 servers, for example, right? And they've installed some software like, the basic operating system and everything else. How long does it take to set it up? I'm just trying to get an idea. So it doesn't. Are we talking with infrastructure automation or without? Just doing it without, well, yeah, without automation, because, but if you use automation, I want to know, right? So without automation, then with? It's definitely quicker without clustering. That adds a significant Right. So yeah, if maybe let's think of it as a percentage. When you add clustering, what does it do to your how much time does it add to your consulting project, essentially, right? Is it a 200, 300% increase in time that you allot just to make sure that you can install, configure, test, validate the environment? And it could be a rough figure, but 50% longer? Well, that's not too bad. That's not bad. Okay, good. So 50% longer. And this is probably when people think clustering, you probably think of a diagram similar to this. Here we have an Alfresco deployment, a load balancer, 2 or more Alfresco servers, some kind of shared storage, some kind of shared search index, and a shared database. That's probably what we're thinking about, right? But that's not really what it's like, is it? It's more like this, right? It's a lot more complicated to set this up. We think that just, especially for us that are developers and stuff like that, we don't really think about setting up the infrastructure correctly, right? We expect the customer to do it for us, but what if the customer doesn't necessarily know how to do it, okay? Or, they might have special best practices that apply to their enterprise that you were not aware of, and then you need to conform to, and so forth and so on. How do you set this up in a way that is fault tolerant, that's secure from a network intrusion perspective and so forth? That's really the big question, And have you considered in terms of calculating the time that it takes to set up, purchasing, how long it takes to actually purchase the equipment or the VMware licenses or both, right? Sometimes I've had customers who actually deploy to VMware, but they have to buy new servers to run VMware on it, right? So you have to wait like 3 weeks for Dell to ship the servers, and then they, to get VMware installed, and then without automation, then they install, configure, and all that stuff, right? So we've seen some of those types of situations out there. And configuring the network, making sure that you set up the subnets correctly and everything else, that can take a little bit of time. Validating the security and the overall redundancy of the environment, including the database, that takes time. Sometimes we like to say, hey, the DBA should do this. But sometimes some customers don't have a DBA, do they? Right? So my point here is that clusters are not as easy as we might think, and it's not just that clustering Alfresco takes X amount of time just because of the way Alfresco is. It's that to do it right and to do it in a repeatable way is hard, okay? And so we want to find ways to take that process that normally takes months, weeks and months of planning, until you can pull the trigger and then actually do it, which could take 2 days to a week or maybe longer, and we want to decrease that. So my question is, why does it have to take so long, right? Why does it take this long? I personally think that none of us should lose hope about this, right? We should not be frustrated by this. We should try to find ways that for launching an environment in just a few minutes. Take that 2-day process. If I can take a 2-day process and turn it into a 20-minute process, if we use the magic percentages, that's a many thousand, percentage improvement, right? So can we do that and do it in a way that we already know, because it has been automated, because it has been tested and validated, we know it's going to work. So let's go ahead and give that a shot. Let's just jump straight to a demo, okay? So I'm going to use Amazon Web Services to deploy a redundant Alfresco cluster similar to the second illustration I showed you, the really complicated one, right? So for this, I'm going to use CloudFormation, and we're going to go into details a little bit later, so don't worry. I just want to show you some meat now and more details later. So this is going to be my Summit demo. And I'm going to upload a CloudFormation template. I'll tell you what that is a little bit later, but upload a template. What the beauty of the template is that it makes deploying a cluster as easy as filling in a form, okay? And so what I have here is, it's asking me for some information. What's the S3 bucket that you want to use? So I want to use Sala-CF-development happens to be the name of my S3 bucket. Why? Because Alfresco supports, S3. So let's use that to get redundancy, right? What servers do I want? Where do I want them located? Well, in this case, I want to launch them in California, just because that's where I live. So we provide 2 availability zones. That automatically gives us redundancy, and we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But independence, from independent power supplies, independent routing infrastructure, independent everything, right? So let's go ahead and populate that. And let's set up the database and give it a password. It's a secret. where can I SSH from, right? This will let anybody in the world SSH. Maybe we should be a little bit more specific. Maybe we give it the IP address of my company, but let's leave it like this because I have no idea what the IP address range here is. And let's just give it a username, a username for the database and an SSH key so I can connect to the environment at some point in the future. So that's it. So I fill out a form, hit continue. I can not tag it if I want. I get a confirmation screen and then hit continue. That's it. Right now, AWS is instantiating 2 Alfresco servers, 2 NAT gateways, 1 load balancer, 2 database servers on completely separate availability zones, completely separate subnets, right? Redundant infrastructure, okay? And it's repeatable. It's automatic. The beauty of this is that I'm not starting up just an Alfresco image. It's actually a blank Linux image. And the system is now going to be downloading Alfresco from the internet. It's going to be actually running the installer in completely headless mode. And it's going to tell it, it's going to parameterize everything. So it's going to say, hey, I just created a database. That's the value that you're going to use to connect to. This is the login and password. Alfresco clustering, a lot of the time that we spend, configuring it is with setting up Hazelcast and setting up J groups and all that stuff, especially with versions prior to 4.2, right? So it does that for you. It knows the IP addresses and ranges and everything else and just does it for you. So right now that environment is starting up and it's going to take about 20 minutes. And we can keep tabs on what's happening in the environment right here. So this log tells us from the moment that I click submit, it's setting up all the different things for us, right? And it's just telling me what the results of all these things are. Okay? So it's creating something. Once it's up and running, you get basically an event that says I've completed everything, and the system automatically outputs the URL to the Alfresco server. In this case, for some reason, not for some reason, we put the Alfresco endpoint just for easy testing of the core repo, but we can just go ahead and launch a browser here and paste this URL. Let's change it to share. And that's it. I'm hitting the load balancer directly, okay, and that's automatically sending me off to one of the Alfresco servers in the cluster, and I should be able to log in. So I know internet connection is a little. Turn off your cell phones, please. Anyway, so there we go, right? And so I can log in as normal and all that fun stuff, right? So it's a cluster. Now, it might be a little hard to believe, but if I showed you on the console what the servers look like, if I go into the EC2 part of things, you're going to see there's just a bunch of servers up and running right now. Okay? So that's actually 2 clusters running separately, right? Because I had run the template twice just for the sake of time. But there you go. And that doesn't include the database, and you don't see the load balancers in here or anything along those lines. So pretty cool, huh? Awesome? Come on, that's a cluster. That's really kick-ass. I mean, here's the thing. I just saved you a ton of time and money doing this for you, right? Maybe the SIs among you are going like, those are billable hours. Use the time wisely. Use it to customize the environment and the code for your customers. That's the point, right? You guys don't have to be system administrators, right? That's not where your expertise lies. So let me take care of that for you, okay? So let's go ahead and move on here. All right, so what did we just do? As I described, we set up that redundant environment, okay? So load balanced across 2 availability zones, redundant regions, and everything else, replicated database, and the network isolation prevents intrusion in the environment. So let's talk about how this works by taking a look at AWS. Now, some of you are familiar with AWS, a small handful, the rest of you are not, so let's talk about what I call the trinity of AWS services. So the core services that we care about in this particular context, the primary ones, are EC2, that's compute. That's virtual servers on demand, and you pay by the hour. The next one is S3. That's an object storage. If you guys were in the session next door, there was some mention of object storage, right? And so S3 is one of these things, and it's provided by Amazon. The beauty of S3 is that you don't pay, like if you need 300 gigabytes, you don't pay for 300 gigabytes. You pay by what you store, and it's 10 cents a gigabyte. I mean, that's cheap. 10 cents a gigabyte per month, and you've got redundant fault-tolerant storage. You don't have to worry about setting up a NAS gateway or something along those lines. It's just done for you. Okay? You have RDS, Relational Database Service, which supports all the same databases that Alfresco supports. So MySQL, Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server, and there's more stuff coming down the pike. So those are the core services, and in this particular case, because I want to have better control over the networking, I also use VPC, Virtual Private Cloud. That allows me to control the infrastructure, control the underlying networking so that I can assign my own IP addresses and even make this part of my company intranet if I wanted to. Okay? I can use VPNs, for example, to connect my intranet to that environment in such a way that this Alfresco deployment can only be accessed by an employee behind the firewall. That's a very important distinction. We're extending our on-prem environment into the cloud in a very secure, controlled way, and VPC enables that. There is one more thing that we're taking advantage of, and that is CloudFormation, and that's what we're going to talk a bit about today. Okay? So CloudFormation automates deployments into Amazon Web Services. It basically manages AWS resources. Okay? And so these resources are, of course, EC2, virtual instances, network subnets, right, the VPC stuff, firewall rules, okay, your databases, and anything else that AWS has. In 2006, AWS launched with just one service, and that was S3. That was pretty easy to figure out. But nowadays, they have over 30, right, guys? How many services do we have on AWS now? How many? 36 services. And I'm sure next week at Amazon reInvent, they're going to announce like 3 more. And AWS is the only technology company that I'm aware of that actually lowers prices over time. Did you guys know that? How many times have you guys lowered prices?
35 times over the last 3 or 4 years.
Okay, so 35 times over the last few years. I mean, Alfresco doesn't do that. I'm kind of ashamed, So the point here is that, CloudFormation is what allows us to describe an environment in a very explicit way and saying, you know what? This is how we're going to do it. And using the common infrastructure that AWS is going to give us, it gives us consistency. That means that if you guys deploy Alfresco in AWS and you guys deploy Alfresco in AWS, you are deploying a consistent environment. So when you call Alfresco for support and you tell us, I've deployed to AWS, it makes things easier for us. Right? We have a better ability. We know what AWS is, what it offers. If we find a bug or something, maybe with a CloudFormation template or something else, we can tell you, oh, by the way, yeah, you run AWS, you might want to switch this around because we just learned something new, right, about this. So it's generally a very good thing. So let's take a little closer look at CloudFormation here. And in this case, I'm going to look at a very basic CloudFormation template. Okay? Now I realize that it's a little bit hard to see, but the general theme of it is that a CloudFormation template has generally about 3 core elements. And this one, in this case, launches a pre-built Alfresco image, right? It just launches it. So what we're doing here is describing in this top section of the file, we're describing the core, base AMI. In other words, which image are we going to launch? What the instance size, so how big of a server are we going to launch in? So that's right here. Let's see, instance size right here. C1 medium is the server that we're launching there. Okay. Some SSH keys and stuff so I can connect to the environment. We can set up monitoring and firewall rules and stuff like that. But this top part just kind of says, okay, you know what? This is the server that the image that you're going to run on this type of a server in the East Coast of the United States. In this case, no monitoring is required. Okay, and by the way, if you want to find out what firewall rules to apply, reference this thing, and we're going to see that in a few minutes, in a few seconds. Okay, so the second part of the file is actually the firewall rules, right? And so here we're basically describing who can connect from where and on what port. Okay, so we can define by protocol, TCP or UDP, by port number, and where the source connection comes from. So in this case, anytime you do this, you're opening it up to the whole world, but maybe we can restrict it to, a specific IP address range. And so now we're just telling the environment through software, through configuration, this is what you're going to do, right? And that's the beauty of this. It's a very dynamic type of a configuration. And so we can go ahead and configure all these elements, protocols, ports, and allowed IP address ranges. The third element is the output. So once a template finishes running and doing its thing, it generates output. It says, it can say anything, right? In this particular case, I'm going to say, hey, your Alfresco server is available on this, URL. So just take the string HTTP, append the, in this case, the public DNS name of the server, and add /share to the end, and boom, that's it. It's not bad, right? Nod knowingly, please. Okay. So let's revisit that CloudFormation template and just understand a little bit more about it. Okay? So as I mentioned before, it configures multiple availability zones. I mentioned that availability zones are redundant. Let's understand a little bit more about what I mean here. So Amazon Web Services has data centers, in all over the world, right? Each major geography is called a region. Okay? So there's a region that happens to be based out of Dublin, for example, and that's EU West. That's what it's called. There's a region in Virginia that's called US East. There are 2 regions in the west coast of the United States, one in Northern California and one in Oregon. I have no idea why you guys did California and Oregon. I mean, they're just right next to each other, but anyway, I digress. So, but we have 2 regions there, and we have Tokyo and Brazil and Sydney and Singapore, right? Did I miss any? Antarctica? Anyone? No? Okay. Yeah, there's, by the way, cooling in Antarctica, very, very cheap. So the cheapest servers are going to be down there. Okay, anyway. Right. So, anyway, the point is that within a region then, Amazon sets up at least 2, and usually more than that, availability zones. Think of it within a city, different buildings, right? Different data centers. Each availability zone is redundant and independent and isolated. The beauty of this is that, an earthquake might strike or a car might crash into a building or whatever it is, power might just go out, but it will affect generally one availability zone and not the other. That's why our template deploys Alfresco to 2 availability zones, okay? Because that way we insulate ourselves from major catastrophes associated with one region. Your data center provider, vendor, probably does not give you 2 buildings that you can deploy to, not without charging you extra money. On AWS, this kind of comes for free. I realize I'm sounding a little bit like I should be working for Amazon and not Alfresco, but bear with me. I happen to be a fan, just like I'm a fan of Apple, and apparently I'm a fan of stickers. Anyway, so let's look at one availability zone. Within one availability zone, we set up a load balancer, and we have the ability to launch any number of Alfresco servers. By default, we run 1 server in each availability zone, but the template is actually set up to do more. It's set up to automatically add servers to the cluster in an elastic fashion. So let's say that you are, I don't know, doing a payroll run or something like that, or maybe you're scanning a lot of documents and you need extra servers. The system, the CloudFormation template describes certain limits, thresholds, in terms of CPU performance and network latency, that once they're met, the system's going to say, okay, I need to launch more servers, all right? And we'll launch them as quickly as possible. And then when the CPU load reaches a certain bottom threshold, it'll start removing servers until you're left with the original configuration, okay? You might have questions about how does Alfresco license this? We'll discuss that later. So we set up the multiple servers and availability zones, and we set up a master-slave MySQL database using RDS, which is a managed database service, right? And so the other thing that we do is notice this little box here. This is a very small little server, and it is, in a sense, it's an optional component, but it's called a bastion host. Think of it as a gatekeeper. So if I need to, as an administrator, if I need to connect to this Alfresco server, this particular template, the way that it's set up, it won't let you. It won't let you hit that server directly because this is a completely independent subnet, as is the database, okay? So the only way that I can get in and the way that the firewall rules are set up is through a NAT instance or the load balancer. And the load balancer is configured, to only direct HTTP and HTTPS, right? And the NAT instance is just a little machine that you can SSH into, and from there, you can then SSH and hop over to the Alfresco servers, okay? It's a security precaution. It also gives us some additional ancillary services when it comes to accessing S3 buckets, because we use the S3 connector for this, okay? But that's the basics. So far, so good? Did you expect, by the way, for me to start talking about subnets and all that BS? You know, no, yes, maybe, I don't know. Yeah, it's like, I'm not sure I signed up for this. Well, neither am I. So I'm going to just show you one small section of this 1,035 line CloudFormation template, just to explain, try to communicate what it's trying to do. So aside from setting up the network and the resources, right, and saying a server here, a network there, you know, blah, 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 it actually, as I said before, downloads and configures Alfresco automatically. And so this is just a small part of clustering Alfresco. Just a small little file. So those of you, you know, a lot of you are system integrators, you're probably familiar. When I look at these paths here, like Tomcat shared, classes, Alfresco extension, you know this, right? This is familiar to all of us. So all I'm doing here is saying, you know what? Let's go ahead and set up Hazelcast in this case to use AWS's, you know, it's built-in AWS support, okay? And let's configure some information such as which region, security group, everything else, and let's output those values into these context files. And then a little bit later down the line, we're going to move those files to the corresponding location on the server. Okay? And this is just one subset. There are, I don't know, about 300-400 lines where you see essentially these config files being written dynamically. Now, you might ask, you know, why don't you do this in Chef or Puppet? And the short answer is, I want to, and we will. But right now we wanted to keep it, in a sense, contained to one template. So you can look at one thing and know what it does. Okay? And if you don't know what Chef or Puppet are, we can talk about that later. Okay? So let's look at that file in a little bit more detail. All right. So I told you, it's okay, you know what, I lied. I said 1,035. It's 1,085 if you count that blank line at the bottom. But anyway, so what this file does, and I'm going to start here at around line 300 and something, I think. It's a little bit different to see, hard to see. Here we go. Okay. So we describe a resource called an Alfresco instance. Now we're not going to go line by line here. And then what are you doing, like taking a picture of this, Tony? Seriously. It's like, hold on. I can only see like 0.03% of the file. Let me take a picture of that. It's like, this is really important, guys. So, okay. So here's what we got. We've got essentially a lot of that exporting of values and basically creating a config file dynamically out of elements. Now, this is very old school in a sense, because what we're doing is using just Unix echo commands, for example, to output and export certain variables out to somewhere and to pipe certain data into things like a shell script. So what this actually is doing starting at around line 350 or so, is that it's actually going to create these little scripts so even the script itself, the script that configures Alfresco is itself being generated dynamically. It's a little meta, as we like to say. It's a little bit like Inception. You know that movie, Inception, dream within a dream within a dream? That's basically what we're having. And I cannot make a reference to the movie Inception without kind of going, bam, because that's what they do in the movie anyway, the soundtrack. Great soundtrack, by the way. So anyway, the point here is that we're creating a shell script that itself then runs all the necessary commands and writes out the config files and everything else, you know, to basically configure my server, and even, you know, does a couple little, you know, launches Alfresco and then kills it, and, you know, does some funky things. But the point here is that we're automating the setup. The things that we do normally manually and where we might forget or skip a step by accident, it's scripted. It's pre-scripted, right? And so it's here, ready to go. And so we write out all the different files that we want, and then ultimately the server launches. So let me show you another section. This is the part that actually installs Alfresco. And one of the first things it starts doing here is that it starts creating an option file for the Alfresco installer, right? So that's what we're seeing right there. You know, so we're basically creating that option file and setting, you know, and basically telling it what the database password and login are going to be and everything else. And that's all going to be referencing the stuff that we provide via that form, that nice user-friendly form that we saw on the CloudFormation console. This is where it gets used, right? And so now we take user-provided parameters, and then we inject them into the file, and then the system does its thing. And so anyway, so there's a lot more of this, a lot of Hazelcast and tuning the cache, because we've been learning a lot about deploying Alfresco to AWS. And so we try to take a lot of these best practices and we put them in this CloudFormation template. I'm not going to tell you that this CloudFormation template is 100% perfect, okay? Despite how I was leading and introduced the session, kind of saying, you want to get to that point, right? My objective here is that I would like you guys to help me make this as close to perfect as we can, okay? Don't be intimidated by this, by the way. In any case, we create the environment. We even create special users and groups for all this, and the system runs. Anyway, so that's it. I'm not going to bore you with the rest of the file. You're going to want to look at it, and I'm going to give you a URL that you can go visit, and so forth. So, whoops. Yeah, right. So, what I'd like to do is call your attention to 2 white papers that Amazon wrote, okay, and with our cooperation, but AWS wrote this. And these 2 white papers make reference and describe this CloudFormation template in a lot of detail. And I'll give you a URL for that as well. So don't worry, I'll be really nice to you. I saw you like, oh shit, I gotta take notes. No. And I just said a cuss word, I'm sorry. And it goes into the recording as well. They're gonna have to bleep me. So anyway, so the point is that there's white papers that you can reference. So let's talk now about security. The main security approach that we're taking here relates to securing the Linux environment as a whole, and Alfresco naturally and so forth. But really it's network security and making sure that only people with the right credentials can access the environment, but only by going through certain prescribed paths, right? We want to avoid people, hackers basically hacking the network and getting access to the server. So I described a lot of this, so I don't think I need to go into too much detail. But once again, we created those private subnets. We use the Bastion hosts to act as a gateway, right? The firewall rules are very explicit as to what can go through and what cannot. Right? The load balancer is the only thing that's allowed to pass HTTP traffic to that environment. Okay? The database is isolated itself, right? So only Alfresco can access the database, not even the load balancer can't access the database, right? So it's all very isolated. But there are other security concerns that we have to be aware of and we have to mitigate. So, the first thing that I would like to share with you is the concept of shared responsibility. And it starts with Amazon, continues with Alfresco, and ultimately ends with you. Okay? We all have a role to play in making sure that the environment is secure. Amazon has written a series of white papers, and they'll reference shortly, about security and compliance and how it works within their data centers. The fact is that, to get into a data center, I think you basically need to submit DNA samples and basically, access a little murder hole where a security guy is going to look at you and basically point a gun at you until you, whatever, show him your credentials. I'm kidding, right? But the point is they're very secure, right? And so it starts with that. Data center security, access to the actual physical equipment, and so forth. Then there's network security, and they do all of their work there as well. But then it comes to Alfresco. When we install and configure Alfresco, we want to make sure that Alfresco itself has been configured and the access control lists are set up in such a way that we know who can do what on the environment, right? And that's application level access control. And then you guys, when you install and configure this, you want to know who's got the keys to the kingdom, right? Who's the administrator for the Alfresco app versus the system administrator with the Linux credentials, right? And you want to make sure that you control the keys. Right, so that you know who has access, so you know those credentials are well protected. Of course, use encryption, SSL, et cetera, to make sure that any communications with the environment are secure. You have to be vigilant, use monitoring, et cetera, and then study these white papers here. So aws.amazon.com/security and compliance, and yeah, take a look at those, and they'll give you a lot of information as to some best practices for securing an environment, but also it gives you some information as to which audits they've gone through in order to validate their environment, and you know that they have the controls and governance that are necessary. So with that, let's talk money. So the topic of the session is cost-effective, secure, and scalable deployments. In a sense, we went backwards. We started with scalability. We talked a little bit about security. And now we're going to talk about cost. So I think we all tend to obsess over basically how big of a check we write, usually, right? It's like, how much cash am I paying for something? And we tend to forget that there are other costs associated with any kind of technology deployment, et cetera. Probably the single biggest one is time, right? And so AWS commissioned an IDC report. Was it IDC or some? Yeah, IDC report that shows that an enterprise over the course of 5 years can save up to 70% in terms of IT costs when you take into consideration power, cooling, time to deployment, the fact that you can do your IT workers can be more efficient and so forth and so on. Okay, let's pretend for a moment that that's overly optimistic. Even if you can get 35% improvement, I think that is dramatic. Okay, in terms of the 5-year cost. And we know that Alfresco is not the kind of software that runs for just 3 weeks, is it? Okay, it's going to run for a year, 2 years, 3 years. We've had customers that have been with us since 2005, right? So an Alfresco environment is going to live for a long time, okay? And so we got to start applying long-term thinking into our cost calculations and so forth. Using things and techniques like the CloudFormation template, virtualization in general, and Amazon in particular, certainly, we can generally install and configure an environment up to 30 times faster, okay? Something can take me 15 minutes instead of 15 days, and so we can deploy our environments a lot faster. You can do a lot more with less, right? It's a lot easier for me to sit down and open up a terminal and access my my Alfresco environment or my AWS environment and basically add more servers and everything else. It's a lot easier to do it from a terminal or a console than it is for me to actually go run over to the rack and plug in the server, right? So all that gives us IT productivity gains. And your go live, your launch, if we can deploy faster and create test and development environments a lot more quickly, we can also benefit in terms of going live sooner. And being able to launch your server sooner is vitally important here, okay? So because we did a Forrester analysis that tells you that says that you would get your return on Alfresco investment about 10 months after you launch the service, right? But the problem, so the thing is, if you do an on-prem implementation, you have to acquire the hardware, and basically from day 0 when the project officially starts and the contract with Alfresco is signed and everything else, if we can shave 30–40% off the time, we can get you to that launch date a lot sooner so that you can experience the ROI earlier. And this could be the difference between fiscal year 1 and fiscal year 2. And a CFO would care about that. So ultimately, this all adds up. Okay, so you get the benefits of virtualized and programmatic infrastructure such as AWS that lowers your overall total cost of ownership. Your infrastructure acquisition time, you no longer have to wait for Dell or HP to ship you the servers. That goes down dramatically. Your time to install and configure Alfresco goes down dramatically, and then the time to an ROI with Alfresco improves. Implementation time is about the same. So there's no significant change. It still takes X amount of time to configure and program Alfresco to do something. If anything, you get time savings just setting up a replica environment if you ever need to debug something, etc. So let's kind of summarize what we've been talking about. So deployments on AWS take minutes, not weeks. Okay? You can customize the CloudFormation template to suit you and your customers' needs. Okay? Security is a shared responsibility. Don't forget that. And it applies everywhere, even within an on-prem deployment. There are many factors to cost efficiency, and so let's not obsess just over the check, but also look at time and how that impacts things. I'd also like to give you guys a shameless plug. You can try Alfresco by going to testdrive.alfresco.com, and you can try solutions built on top of Alfresco, and this is all powered by CloudFormation. Okay? So we use CloudFormation templates to launch these solutions developed by many of our partners. Okay? And here are the resources I promised you. Those are the URLs you want to copy down. So the presentation itself, and of course, once you download the presentation, you'll have everything else. We have the white papers and reference implementation at this URL here. It's a little long, but just go whitepaper/alfresco-enterprise-on AWS. Okay? The CloudFormation template is on GitHub. I've open sourced it, Apache. Okay? So pick it up, modify it, contribute back. That's my favor, the favor that I ask of you. And if you have any questions whatsoever, send me an email. Okay? If you're a partner that has a solution that you want to publish in that test drive thing, send me an email. So with that, I would like to open this up to questions. Are there any questions? Yes.
Excuse me.
There's a microphone coming, yes. And how are we doing on time here? Let me just double check. We're good, right? 7 minutes. But yeah, go ahead.
Just to be slightly mean, you mentioned licensing.
Yes.
Is there anything you can kind of share on the scale-out licensing?
So I think what you want to do is just honestly just say, I'm going to need scale out, and we'll have a conversation. We don't have a formal policy, but we have a couple of environments where we've built scaling into the pricing to allow for seasonal increases in load. So yeah, it's a call-us pricing is what it boils down to, because there's no formal policy yet. I want to formalize it, and we're probably going to have to wait till the end of Alfresco's fiscal year before we can really have an honest-to-goodness formal policy. But it requires some discussion. In the meantime, talk to your sales rep, talk to your partner manager, and of course, talk to me, and we'll try to help you out. Okay? Thank you. Yes. Other questions? Was this awesome? Interesting? Yes. Well, the magic is all there. So the thing is, open the file, figure it out, and you'll see how it's set up, and help me out, really. So if there are no other questions, let's go to lunch, all right? Thank you, everybody.